Welcome to Pickwick Monthly, everyone. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my Pickwickian co-host for today is James Armstrong. Hi, James.
Hi, how are you?
I am so excited to have you with us today. This is going to be a lot of fun. And for 20 months, everyone, we are talking about Charles Dickens's The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, as it was first serialized in monthly parts from March 1836 to October 1837. Once a month, myself and one of a rotating set of co-hosts talk about each serialized part for 20 straight months. Along the way, I'll share some of the items in the Rosenbach's collections. We have complete serial issues of the Pickwick Papers, also a portion of the Pickwick manuscript. James and the other Pickwickian co-hosts saw these a couple weeks ago when they visited the Rosenbach. We had a good time all together, huh, James?
Very exciting, yeah.
What I found fascinating was that at one point we were all sitting at a table looking at the original parts, and all of us were looking at advertisements and reading all these high literary people. We were all like fascinated with, Rowlandson's, toilet, stuff. It was hilarious. So,
well, we've all read the book before. It was the ads that were new.
Yeah. So, the Rosenbach also has many first editions signed by Dickens, earliest surviving literary manuscript of Dickens, letters, ephemera, even a lock of his hair. I'll share some of these things in the coming months. In today's episode, number 3, chapters 6 to 8, a convict, a cricket match, and the course of true love. The stranger in the green coat returns and finally gets a name. We can stop calling him the stranger in the green coat and other, phrases we have for him. The fat boy wants to make your flesh creep. And we also have a new illustrator following the death of Robert Seymour. Robert William Buss was hired, but this is the only issue that he illustrated, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. If you're watching live right now, please like and subscribe and have fun in the live chat. And if you're watching the recording, still, please like and subscribe and have fun leaving comments or questions at the bottom of the video, and I will answer them. My co-host today is James Armstrong. James teaches at the City University of New York and is the author of the book Romantic Actors, Romantic Dramas, British Tragedy on the Regency Stage. I think the book cover is behind him there on the shelf. With Ellen O'Neill, right? That's the actress you told me?
Eliza O'Neill.
Yeah. On the cover. James's adaptation of A Christmas Carol was recently produced by Passage Theater Company in Trenton, New Jersey, and his play Dickens Condensed has been performed internationally from Staten Island to Japan. He is a member of the Dickens Fellowship, the Dickens Society, and the Dramatists Guild of America. James, I am so happy to have you with us on this show.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
And we've had great interactions over Dickens over the years, and that's how we know each other. Although I think maybe the first time we met is when you came and read at the Moby Dick Marathon.
Yes, that was quite a fun time.
Yeah, but you do you have a Pickwick origin story? The first time you read Pickwick, or Dickens in general? However, what's your Dickens story?
So, like many of the original readers of Pickwick, I first picked it up in installment 4 for different reasons. Of course, installment 4 we haven't gotten to yet, but that was where sales really picked up. And one thing that I believe is in installment 4 is the Madman's Manuscript, one of those interpolated tales. And I had been doing some research on Dickens and the detective story. And I had read that Edgar Allan Poe, somebody I think you might know a little about, that Edgar Allan Poe had influenced or had been influenced by Dickens by reading the Madman's Manuscript.
We'll get to that next month.
Yeah. And so I said, well, I need to read the Madman's Manuscript. So I went out and I bought a copy of Pickwick Papers. I was in high school at the time. This is that copy that I bought in high school
Is that a signet?
just to get Madman's manuscript.
Is that a signet? Is that the signet copy?
Yeah, it's a signet. So I originally just read the Madman's manuscript for this paper I was writing on Dickens and detective stories. But I had a copy of the book. So later, after I finished that paper, I said, I should read the book. And then I read the whole book and was quite impressed. I had read other Dickens novels before, but as you've talked about, this is an unusual Dickens novel. It is not your typical Dickens. And I'm very much a fan of those interpolated tales. Mm-hmm. The fact that there are lots of standalone pieces in this book that you don't necessarily have to understand everything that's going on in the novel in order to appreciate. And there's some of that in this installment as well, both the interpolated tale and the interpolated poem.
Yeah, well, I've agreed about this month too. So that was your intro. Was Madman's manuscript, and then Pickwick. Because of that, it took hold. And then did you right away start reading the rest of Dickens?
So I had already gotten into Dickens by that point.
Okay.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be researching Dickens and detective stories.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I had read The Mystery of Edwin Drood. I had read Bleak House, so I was very much looking forward to reading other Dickens novels. I don't recall necessarily which order I read them all in, other than I believe I saved for last Great Expectations.
Oh, did you?
Which is, one of his most famous. But I read Barnaby Rudge before I read Great Expectations.
Well, that's a great one anyway. And there's the Big Poe connection in that one with Grip.
Yes, yeah.
So I know that one pretty well. I've actually saved one. I still have not read Little Dorrit. And I have many years ago saw the Christine, is it Ezard movies that she did, the twin movies of Little Dorrit from two different perspectives. But it was so long ago, I forget most of the plot. And I've been planning to do it as a read with other people, but Pickwick seemed the way to go for this. So I'm still saving. I still have one that I will still be amazed at in reading for the very first time, which will be fun. So I don't know how I'll ever do it, but one of these days. Well, let's get started with this month. When it was originally published in 36, it still wasn't selling well, Pickwick Papers. The first issue, they printed 1,000. They didn't sell them all. And the second issue last month, they printed 500, and they still weren't selling them all. They moved it back up to 1,000 for this month, and we're really hoping that things were going to pick up, but they had not picked up yet. And they needed a new artist for this, right? I mean, Seymour had died, and they had mentioned it in the last issue that, that we were going to continue on and it's, and move forward with this, but we need a new artist. And they tried out Thackeray, right? William Thackeray, who was just getting started himself. He hadn't done Vanity Fair yet. And he was also an illustrator. People don't know he actually did all his own illustrations for his novels, and started with Vanity Fair, and was, trying to break into the business at the time. But they didn't choose him. John Leach was also considered. Leach wound up later was the main illustrator for A Christmas Carol. I think they cut, but they really wanted somebody who was. They didn't want somebody like Seymour again, right? They didn't want this, well-established person who Dickens wanted to do this. He was writing it, and they needed a kind of more of a junior partner illustrator who was just going to illustrate Dickens's works. And they came up with someone had recommended Robert William Buss. Young, had a little bit of a reputation at the time for humorous illustrations. He used to like to do paintings of actors as well in their well-known roles. But he was not so famous, and he would cost a lot of money. Like they could have hired Crookshank for this. Crookshank winds up working with Dickens in Next and Oliver Twist. But Crookshank would have been a lot more money than than Buss. So they bring Buss in, but Buss, even according to his own account of this many years later, he said he was not yet acquainted with the etching needle, because not only did he need to do the illustrations, then he had to do the etchings, and then the acid, what was it called? The coping in, I can't remember what the phrase is for it, but then to put the acid on to make the the plates. And he wasn't satisfied with his results. They had someone else do it, I think, and they didn't turn out as well. We will share. He does do 2 illustrations for this. And in the copy that I always share for the University of Victoria Library, they don't have Buss's original illustrations in it. Neither does the copy at the Rosenbach, because as soon as they do this initial print run of 1,000, but as soon as they're gone, they start reprinting it, because Pickwick becomes very popular and they need to keep reprinting back issues. But by then they have their next illustrator, Phiz, Hablett Knight Brown, and he redraws 2 illustrations, and they put those in all the reprintings. So very rare are copies of the Pickwick serial with Buss's original illustrations. It's a very rare serial copy. But today we'll look at them all. We'll look at Buss's illustrations, and we'll look at Phiz's. One Phiz does the same thing, and the other one he completely replaces and does a different scene. And we'll talk about all those today. I had in my research that Buss was paid £6, 10 shillings for each of his plates. So it's not a great deal of money, and it's much less than Dickens is making for the issues now. And Buss was, after they, and we'll look at them later, and they're not that great, I don't think. And certainly Dickens and Chapman and Hall didn't think that they were that great, or they were just so unhappy with the etchings and how they turned out that they didn't like them either. We don't have exact confirmation of why. I don't think we do, of why they moved on from Buss. Do you have any more information on that I haven't mentioned, James?
Not really. I mean, Buss was a wood engraver, and he knew how to do wood engravings, but he was fairly new to steel engravings, and he wrote that he had to go to somebody else and pay somebody else to do them. Yeah. And he said that they lacked originality then, because if he had been able to do both the illustrations and the etchings, he felt like they would have been more fresh and original. But he himself said they didn't feel particularly original when somebody else who was not the illustrator had done the etchings.
Yeah. And he was confident that had they either postponed this issue, he could have mastered it, or at least by the next issue, he would have mastered it. But he wasn't going to be given that time. They wanted to move on right away. He was angry about being dumped. He says that he erased all. He never talked about Pickwick for a very long time. But he never really seemed to blame Dickens over it. It seemed that he was more angry with Chapman and Hall, the publishers, and how he was handled. And such was his admiration for Dickens that towards the end of his life, just after Dickens had died, he had painted this portrait of Dickens known as Dickens' Dream, and I'm going to pull it up now to share with people. Well-known painting of Dickens' Dream, surrounded by all his characters. And it's so striking now because it's just this one swash of color and the rest in black and white. But that's entirely unintended. He intended to make the whole thing color.
Yeah.
And I just died while he was still working on this. So this is all we get from it. And this is, I'm assuming this is little Nell on Dickens's knee here.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And it's inspired by Luke Fildus's The Empty Chair painting of Dickens that he made after Dickens died, when he just painted the chair and the desk and the study empty after Dickens died, and became very famous. And actually, if you ever see the Fildus's Empty Chair, it really is, it's almost a copy. He's just moved the chair back some, but it's the identical chair and desk and everything set up that Buss has done here to create this magnificent painting. I mean, I would have loved to have seen the whole thing in color. I've seen colorized versions of this, but it's also so striking just in its incompleteness.
Yeah.
And I think also giving that hint too, that for as much as Dickens created here, there is still a sense that, like, because he died when he was 58, that it's almost like his life itself could have been twice this. Twice these number of characters that we see here. So Buss winds, I mean, clearly he still thinks Dickens is a magnificent artist and creates him here, and this is just a great portrait of him as well. So that's Robert Buss. Only one issue. And angry about he being dumped, but he is replaced by Phiz, How About Night Brown, and we'll talk about Phiz next month when he comes on board and we have his illustrations. Another interesting thing about this issue, number 3, and it's not in the original one that we shared, because that one was a later printing, so it doesn't have Buss's illustrations, but it also doesn't have what wound up being the first advertisements in Pickwick serial. This is my facsimile that Easton Press did in 1980, I think it is, or 81. And this is a true facsimile, and that every issue they tried to make exactly like the first printing of each issue. And even on the cover here, we even have with illustrations by R.W. Buss. And that would have been the only issue then that had that. And next month, they just, originally it had with 4 illustrations by Robert Seymour, and now it has this. And then for the next one, they just have with illustrations. And they continued with that. Like, who knows? Maybe the illustrator they had wasn't going to continue. And they just had with illustrations for the rest of the run. But also in this were some advertisements. These little insert advertisements in the front, which I'll get to in a moment. And then in the back, there were always advertisements on the back cover and the inside back cover. Oh, not in the inside, but just on the back cover. And there are other publications from Chapman and Hall. But now they have an advertisement in here, the toilette, or the toilet, an age remarkable for the rapid progress of refinement, demands in this particular department a combination of the useful and elegant, blah, blah, blah. It's for Rowland and Son, who would make these toiletry products, Calidor and their Macassar oil. And what they had, Chapman and Hall had realized, was they could not only advertise their own publications here, and they have these inserts here. Hey, let's sell advertising space to other companies for their products and make even more money. And especially as these issues weren't selling especially well by this point, it was a great way to increase revenue for their issues. And they will eventually wind up having an entire advertisement section in the beginning and the end during the run of Pickwick called the Pickwick Advertiser. And it's just chock full of ads that are completely fascinating to see. In this one, though, what is fascinating is there's 3 advertisements in the front. One is for Sunday Under 3 Heads, which is a pamphlet by Timothy Sparks. The other is The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, by Bowes, edited by Bowes. And then The Library of Fiction or Family Storyteller. And that was another Chapman and Hall, which it was just tales, essays, and sketches every month that would come out. And Dickens actually contributed to that as well for little stories. On the back, there was maps, traveling and hunting maps of the English counties, a nursery government or hints addressed to mothers and nursery maids, the management of young children, all Chapman and Hall publications. They're trying to get that out there. But it's the Sunday Under 3 Heads that is the most interesting, because Timothy Sparks, it was published 2 shillings. Timothy Sparks is who, James?
Charles Dickens.
Publishing a secret pamphlet in a sense, because people didn't really know Charles Dickens much. I mean, if you think about it, most of the readers of the Pickwick of Pickwick, just he's Bowes. They don't really even know him much as Charles Dickens yet. He's
They
still
probably don't even pronounce it Bowes because they don't know the story behind the name.
True. But Dickens, this is it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, kind of, his pieces for changes in government, society, how things work in his day. And it is a Sunday Under 3 Heads was a 12,000 word attack on recently proposed legislation in 1836 that would have prohibited all leisure, recreational activities, and shopping on Sundays. Even cricket would be banned under this bill. You couldn't have your Sunday cricket match after Mass. And Dickens thought this was ridiculous, and it's as political as he gets. And that throughout the rest of his life, he would write speeches. But he was mostly always out for causes. But this, he's very particular against a piece of legislation. Not surprising. He's a reporter for the Morning Chronicle as he's doing things. He's covering elections. He hears politicians making speeches all the time. He's transcribing them. He learned shorthand to do that, right? But he found this legislation particularly pernicious because it was direct, in Dickens's words in Sunday Under 3 Heads, it was directed exclusively and without exception of a solitary instance against the amusements and recreations of the poor, especially for people who work 6 days a week. The only day they have to relax is Sunday. And now here come, the government authorities, and they want to stop them from even having fun on that one day. Because the bill does make exceptions for the servants who work for the nobility. They still have to work, right? Dickens writes, the baronet's dinner must be cooked on Sunday, the bishop's horses must be groomed, the peer's carriage must be driven. The bill never passed, which was good. It was if I remember I can't remember the politician's name out of my head, but this is not the first attempt that he had with this, and it never passed. And this one certainly didn't either. What's fascinating also is the illustrations for this. Let me share the cover for it. This was the cover. Where are we at here? Whoops. That's not it. I don't know why I did that. Let's try it again. Here it is, Sunday Under 3 Heads, as it is, as Sabbath bills would make it, and as it might be made. These were the 3 heads. It's like, as things exist now, and then what it would be like. But Dickens is like, this is what Sundays should be like. And it's this kind of, everybody enjoying themselves and relaxing, escaping the cities and having fun on Sundays. And there's 3 illustrations on it, but the cover here, plus the 3 illustrations inside, and this is the first one, were all done by a guy named Hablett Knight Brown, who becomes Phiz when he's doing the Pickwick Papers. So this was Dickens's actual connection, and Chapman and Hall, the publishers' connection with Brown, who would then illustrate for Dickens later. Well, not later, and later, I mean like next month.
Yeah.
He'll begin illustrating.
Well, there's some controversy as to when Dickens and Brown first met.
Mm-hmm.
We're not entirely sure. We know that they met in order to work together on Pickwick Papers, but they clearly collaborated before in the past. But had they actually met? It's hard to say. They also earlier in their life had lived in nearby one another. So it's entirely possible that they would have met or at least known of one another. Both of them were certainly interested in other artists. Brown was interested in the writers since he was frequently being commissioned to illustrate their work.
Mm-hmm.
And Dickens was certainly interested in illustrators, but had they ever actually met in person before working on Pickwick Papers?
Yeah, we don't know. And I remember he hadn't even met Robert Seymour until right before that second issue, right before Seymour commits suicide. He hadn't met him in the whole lead up to the first issue, and halfway to the second, he hadn't met him yet.
Yeah. It seems a bit odd to us, perhaps, but that's just sort of the way things were.
I mean, they were both working for Chapman and Hall.
Yeah.
And the illustrators were, especially by this point, especially after Seymour now, were just entirely dependent on Dickens just sending them the text, and this is what you're going to illustrate. And that's the only, that's all they need. And everything else could be done by letters. Dickens would respond by letter of what he liked and what he didn't like, and what the illustrators were doing for him, and give them the direction that way. But more Phiz next month. I don't want to go down the Phiz road yet. So it winds up being Bose and Phiz, and it could have been Bose and Bus. So which would have been just as alliterative.
Well, and the way in which Dickens was working with his illustrations does change once he starts working with Phiz.
Yeah.
In part because since he has more to write, he has difficulty writing with enough lead time to give his illustrator enough information. So he has to actually meet with Brown and say, all right, this is what's going to happen. Can you give me something like this?
Well, we will see Phiz's 2 illustrations for this month, because he redid, they wind up redoing Buses, and we'll also see Buses. And then next month, we'll get a little biographical background on Hamlet Knight Brown as well. Also, 1836, May 1836, when this issue number 3 comes out, I'd say it was extraordinarily busy for Dickens, but it wasn't extraordinary, because it was ordinary for the 24-year-old Dickens to completely fill his life with project after project after project. I mean, not just Sundays under 3 heads pamphlet as he writing, and this issue. He's also got a piece, and one of those other things advertised in the front of this, in the library of fiction from Chapman and Hall. He's got a piece called A Little Talk About Spring and the Sweeps. So he's got 3 things that he's written for Chapman and Hall to be published. He's working on a novel that he abandons and doesn't write, but he is still under contract. He's been paid £200 from John McCrone, and for a book called Gabriel Varden, historical novel. It will later be developed in the Barnaby Rudge. And that he's working on right now. And he has a job. He's covering elections for the Morning Chronicle. He heads off to Ipswich at the end of May to cover an election there. And then he uses that whole experience with the crowds and the politicians giving speeches for the depiction of the Eatanswill election coming up in issue number 5. So Dickens is just busy, busy, busy. I mean, halfway through this, James, right? He's halfway through Pickwick Papers. He starts doing Oliver Twist at the same time. So he's publishing 2 serials a month, and he's also like writing a little play, and he's also writing, an essay pamphlet or something, and it's just like this constant treadmill he's on every single month. He stopped writing one thing, and it's like slide the paper over because something else is due as well.
I also find it interesting that once Pickwick ended, instead of just focusing on Oliver Twist, he's like, no, I got to start Nicholas Nickleby now.
Yeah, halfway through. Yeah. So, yeah, and that's funny that because it becomes that later when he realizes after he does this over and over, he says, I need a break. I'm just going to do I'll do a magazine weekly. I'll edit it. Maybe I'll write a little for it, but it doesn't sell as well because he doesn't have a story. So it's not a Dickens serial. And then he starts Little Nell, and him getting off the treadmill winds up him having to do a weekly serial for Old Curiosity Shop and then Barnaby Rudge right after it because it's the money. He's also, this is his living. And if he doesn't keep making the money, and especially by then, he's married now, expecting soon. And he's always got, the family support from here on out.
Not to mention the extended family.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had to take care of brothers and sisters and then their families and ended
his
up
parents, obviously.
His parents and his parents-in-law.
Yeah.
He seems to have kept both his father and his father-in-law out of debtor's prison. So it was quite a number of people he had to provide for.
Well, we are lucky that he was able to get these issues out, and he did. And before we get to the actual story, though, again, in this issue, there's an address from the publishers here, and also a postscript from the editor. And I'm actually going to share the text of that because, again, this is something that was in the first printing and then was never reprinted later in later printings of these issues. So it's harder to come across copies of this stuff. And here is the address.
Uh-oh.
Did I go down? Wow.
Yeah, well, somehow you stopped the recording and then restarted it. I'm not
I actually
sure
didn't. I think it did it on its own. I think I had an issue with my stream. I have to check the stream on.
Well, we appear to be back.
Well,
hopefully we are.
I have to check the stream online.
But you were just talking about those letters to the editor that got sent in.
Yeah, let's get to that in just a second. Let me make sure we are still live on YouTube. And sorry about this. If I'm live and you're watching, I'm sorry this is happening. I can't believe this just killed here. I am having connectivity issues, but there's a first for everything, isn't there?
I suppose so.
I will hopefully edit down a version of this without the break in the middle here. Yeah, I'm unable to connect to anything right now. I can't check the.
Do you want me to check? I believe I have somebody in the next room watching. Do you want me to see if it's working?
Sure.
Okay. Is it working? It's working.
And we're still live.
So apparently it's still working. It's still live, but there's a delay. But apparently the live stream is working.
Okay. I am going to proceed as if everything is just fine.
Okay.
Uh,
Apparently there's a 3-minute delay.
there's always a delay,
Yeah.
but I didn't think it was usually 3 minutes.
What if there is a major problem, I think I'm going to hear shouts from the next room saying, "What's going on here?"
Yeah, I have nothing, and I don't have my chat going either. That has stopped for me. So,
yeah.
All right, let's just proceed.
All right, let's proceed.
I'm going to share the screen for the address from the publishers.
Aha.
We announced in our last that the ensuing numbers of the Pickwick Papers would appear in an improved form, and we now beg to call attention of our readers to the fulfillment of our promise. Acting upon a suggestion which has been made to them from various influential quarters, the publishers have determined to increase the quantity of letterpress in every monthly part. So there's more words. There's, we've increased from up to 32 pages now, from what, 26 to 32? Is that what it is?
Sounds about right.
32 pages of text now, and to diminish the number of plates. It will be seen that the present number contains 8 additional pages of closely printed matter and 2 engravings in steel from designs by Mr. Buss, a gentleman already well known to the public as a very humorous and talented artist. This is where I think this gets interesting. This alteration in the plan of the work entails upon the publishers a considerable expense, which nothing but a large circulation would justify them in incurring. They are happy to have it in their power to state that the rapid sale of the 2 first numbers and the daily increasing demand for this periodical enables them to acknowledge the patronage of the public in the way which they hope will be deemed most acceptable. That's not true. It's not selling well at all. They really need it to sell more. So it's almost this kind of wishful thinking that's going on, like, oh, we're selling. And also the idea that when you promote yourself, you don't promote yourself as somebody that's not doing well, you promote yourself as somebody that's doing exceptionally well. So they have let everyone know that they are doing considerable work here, and that's their, address. I find that fascinating. And then there's a postscript from the editor. Always anxious to amuse the readers by every means in our power, they've published this letter, this kind of letter to the editor going on, which I find really, and first of all, it's punctuated strangely, and they mentioned that too. Our correspondent's notions of punctuation are peculiar to himself. But this odd letter, about a funny letter, James, what do you make of this?
It sounds like something that Dickens would have written just to put in there to create a little bit of verisimilitude or something like that. Just as the Pickwick Papers themselves are supposed to be something that is a truthful account of an actual organization, we have this letter which purports to be a letter that they just randomly received, but I don't know if that's true or not. It's, as you say, it's trying to be funny, but it's almost as if it's trying a little too hard.
Yeah, it seems to fall flat here. This kind of, like, oh, but the horse, kind of defending the horse, which was in the first issue, which was described as, uh, the noblest of animals, described as faint, weary, and overdriven. And I get the feeling that it's not even real, that Dickens is maybe trying to create this thing where people will write in comments and they will respond to them, the editor of Bose responding to the readership, and it doesn't seem to come off well at all. And they never do it again. Like, we never have this in another issue, somebody writing in. Or it was a really strange letter, oddly punctuated, and they think like, oh, we've got to publish this. Somebody's writing this strange letter. If you can't see the punctuation here, it's in times when the great period and the good are period, largely associating for period. And it goes on like that all throughout, that like they're just it's almost like Jingle talking in a way.
Yeah.
With all these direct stops, except they are complete sentences that all the complete stops are put in. So and that's a thought. Who knows? Maybe later they would turn out to be letters from Jingle writing in, or the stranger in green coat. I'm sorry, because he's not named yet. We'll have to come up with his name in a little bit. But this is also in the front of this issue that people will, that the first readers of it had seen, and we'll leave it at that.
And 19th century publications did both. There are instances of actual letters to the editor being published. Yeah. And there are also instances of things that were clearly fictional that were published as if they were letters to the editor, that the reader was often assumed to be in on the joke. Which is the case here, I'm not entirely sure.
All righty. Well, now we're finally on to the issue itself. I did get word too from someone via text that we are still going.
Okay.
So
all right.
Assuming everything is fine. So my only fear is you finish the show when you realize, oh, you were off. Oh, well. But we're recording. We're good. The Pickwickians have finally arrived at Manor Farm, Dingley Dell and Dingley Dell, after all kinds of horse trouble. At the close of last month's issue, they were washed, mended, brushed, and brandied, and ready to be embraced by the Wardle family. So here we go. Chapter 6, an old-fashioned card party, the clergyman's verses, the story of the convict's return. We'll have all of those in this chapter. We begin with this just another impression, everybody together, this whole party. Dickens loves to set the scene. And Dickens as the theater person, right, James? I mean, so frequently for me in Dickens, especially the early novels, chapters open up like you've seen the curtains part, right? And he describes the scene and the setting and the characters and what they're wearing and how they look, just as someone in the audience would watch a play unfold. Very theatrical, Dickens, especially in the early works.
Oh, yes.
And here it's the family, the very old lady who's Wardle's mother, in her lofty cap and faded silk gown, and the young ladies. We've seen them already at the parade in last month's, some of them. But there's now the old lady also has her ear trumpet, and they're all holding things for her, an orange, a smelling bottle. This is her, the young lady's taking care of her grandchildren. Then there's a clergyman and his wife. There's a little hard-headed, ripstone Pippin-faced man. I had to look that up, and there's apparently a Ribston Pippin is a kind of apple. And that took me down a rabbit hole the other day, like varieties of apples and how there used to be like 10,000 varieties of apples, and now there's a lot less, like So like they've just gone, like every area seemed to have their own, not only in England, but in America too. And I'm sure all over the world, every area, very particular area, had their own kind of apple that was slightly different from other apples. And now there's not that much variety now. But this is an apple that they knew, the Ribston apple, and Dickens has it Ribstone here. There's also a fat old gentleman, 2 or 3 more old gentlemen, 2 or 3 more old ladies. So Manor Farm, Wardles Farm is a place where everybody, comes in the area, and they're all having a get together here, and the Pickwickians have been invited. The first humor we get here is there's some good stuff this month, but it's still not the best. It's like, as it's going to become, as Dickens really gets rolling, especially when Sam Weller comes in, and he really winds up being marvelously, inventive with the funny scenes. Yeah, but this is not, it's the old lady can't hear, and they have to keep shouting at her. I almost feel like this would be far funnier to see performed than to read it. But they're shouting at her, Mr. Pickwick, Grandma, and they're screaming, and she just finally, well, it's all very fine, I dare say, but I can't hear him, as Mr. Pickwick's trying to
until they start discussing something she wants to hear about, and then her hearing immediately improves.
Yes, which is when somebody talks about the land around there, right? The hard-headed man, again, the Ribston Pippin man. And they're talking about the land, Mullins Meadows, and the grounded Kent, and then she has something to say about that, right? About the land.
Yes.
And then she calls him a conceited coxcomb. So, out loud, as if he can't hear her.
Yeah.
Or something is the impression we get. And then it's off. So like a lot of shouting. This is what's going on. It's, everybody's shouting, and she can't hear, and people are shouting at her and think that she will hear them even if they shout. And then we're going to have card games. And Mr. Wardle proposes cards. What say you to a rubber, Mr. Pickwick? I think not everybody is used to that term anymore. It doesn't. I grew up hearing it from my parents' generation, always talking about playing a rubber of cards. And when it became a very general term for just a game of cards, Wardle seems to have that there as well. In Johnson's dictionary, the definition of a rubber is a game, a contest, 2 games out of 3. And I grew up also thinking that the rubber game was the one that decided it. Like if there's a tie, then the rubber match was the match or the game or that made the difference. So, but it also is it came to be used for card games in general. And here it's also contrasted with a round game, because the others all play a round game of table, and they play Pope Joan.
Yes.
The younger people, which includes some of, the Pickwickians who are not young, and jokes will be made about that. But the aunt is there, the spinster Aunt Rachel is there, and they play Pope Joan, which is a round game, and everybody, you just go around, you put your cards down, and everything has this terminology. You can look them up. I'm not going to teach everybody how to play Pope Joan. But the difference is that one is a more, and as is described in the text here, the rubber was conducted with the whist. The rubber of whist was conducted with all that gravity of deportment and sedateness of demeanor, and the round game table, on the other hand, was so boisterously merry, and they're all screaming and having fun, and very boisterous. And also at that, Mr. Tupman and the spinster aunt established a joint stock company of fish and flattery. Fish, we know. Do you know what the fish are in cards, James?
I did not come up with that. I actually did quite a bit of research on Pope Joan to try to figure out what was going on.
Do you have any Pope Joan?
I did find the fish.
Well, fish are just counters. That's all. And we got
Okay.
that. We have that in Austin too. The
Yeah.
fish are counters in the game.
I know there was a round thing that you would put in the middle of the table to put the counters in. And then there were various ways to win bits that had been of counters that had been placed in that round apparatus, including matrimony, which comes up.
Yeah.
Matrimony was a king and a queen. If you had a king and a queen
of the trump suit, whatever your trump suit was, the king and queen together, then it's matrimony. And people go matrimony, and apparently the spinster aunt gets it, and the young ladies laugh, and then she's like, "Oh, you're making it," and then Mr. Tupman squeezes her hand under the table, and then she seems to like the fact that she has gotten matrimony.
Well, and the other pair that you can get is a queen and a jack, which is known. Oh, what is it called? There's another term which I sadly have forgotten of. An intrigue. It's known as an intrigue if you have a queen and a jack, which is perhaps fitting for this grouping of chapters here, because we have the potential for perhaps some matrimony down the road between Tupman and the spinster aunt, but then there's going to be an intrigue with a certain Jack inserting himself.
That's fascinating. That's a good catch. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way at all. That works with this game that's going on. Of what's going to occur here through this entire park. Mr. Snodgrass is also getting into it. Remember, he's the poet of the group, and he did nothing but whisper poetical sentiments into his partner's ear. So the Pickwickians are finding this to be a great stop in their journey to, get to associate with all these ladies. Mr. Winkle came out with jokes, which are all very well known in town, but not all known in the country. So Winkle gets to look like this urbane kind of, gentleman, and knows all the funny new jokes. And everybody's having a good time. It says the benevolent clergyman looked pleasantly on, for the happy faces which surrounded the table made the good old man feel happy too. And though the merriment was rather boisterous, still it came from the heart and not from the lips. And this is the right sort of merriment after all. And that whole idea of that it's like this little kind of paradise of happiness going on in this place. And this is something that Dickens kind of recreates over and over in his works and talks about. That those lines I just read, it's something about a Christmas Carol, right? And this kind of freezing moments in time. Wardle talks about this just a little bit later. He says, now this, said the hospitable host, who was sitting in great state next to the old lady's armchair with her hand fast clasped in his, this is just what I like. The happiest moments of my life have been passed at this old fireside. That, these moments are important, not because just of what's happening then in the present, but because they're like this part of this continuous series of moments throughout their lives. It's nostalgia is what it is. I mean, they represent that kind of permanence of small pleasures that they look back on and still occur. And that for me is a theme in Dickens's works throughout. And we have it here right away in Pickwick Papers. Close, I mean, almost like that thing in what's the author for the play Our Town?
Thornton Wilder.
That idea that that she's trying to get them to understand, like, this moment here, look at me, we need to remember being together now. And And Dickens does that in his works, but it's always from not from the desperate side, but always from the people the people do recognize that they have these moments constantly through their lives that are connected to their past. So,
and it makes us better people in Dickens.
And it continues on with the first of the interpolated pieces here, not a tale yet, but it will be in the tale too, but in the poem.
The Ivy Green.
Yeah. I mean, after Wardle even says, he talks about the recollection of old times, the happiness of many years ago. He says to Pickwick, the old houses and fields seem like living friends to me. And so does our little church in the ivy, with the ivy. And then they mentioned the clergyman has a poem. And of course, Snodgrass, the poet, wants to hear the poem. And it's the Ivy Green. And this is the first of the, interpolated pieces in this part. We'll have two this time. But why don't you read the poem, at least read the first verse, not read the whole thing. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. And it was also later set to music by a number of people, including Henry Burnett, who was Dickens's brother-in-law.
Yeah. Married Fanny, right?
Yeah.
Fanny,
His favorite sister. So this was often sung generally with piano accompaniment. So you would be there in your drawing room and somebody would play the piano and everyone would sing along. I will not sing this, however, I'll simply recite, oh, a dainty plant is the ivy green that creepeth o'er ruins old. Of right choice food are his meals, I ween, in his cell so lone and cold. The wall must be crumpled, the stone decayed, to pleasure his dainty whim, and the mouldering dust that years have made is a merry meal for him. Creeping where no life is seen, a rare old plant is the ivy green. Fast he stealeth on, though he wears no wings, and a staunch old heart has he. How closely he twineth, how tight he clings to his friend, the huge oak tree. And slyly he traileth along the ground, and his leaves he gently waves, as he joyously hugs and crawleth round to the rich mold of dead men's graves, creeping where grim death has been. A rare old plant is the ivy green. Whole ages have fled and their works decayed, and nations have scattered been. But the stout old ivy shall never fade from its hale and hardy green. The brave old plant in its lonely days shall fatten upon the past, for the stateliest building man can raise is the ivy's food at last. Creeping on where time has been, a rare old plant is the ivy green.
Well read, thank you. Something that people would have done, read poems to each other, so I enjoy having a poem read to me. Dickens had recycled this poem. He had already written it for I think a lady's scrapbook I came across, and had pulled it out there. But just like all the interpolated tales that happen in this novel, there's a Gothic feel to this poem. He's always got something supernatural, Gothic, death. That's where he seems to like to go for these tales that he tells, including this poem. But this one, it's that Gothic feel too, especially with that kind of time moving on through decay, the death of the past. Just the language alone, it ruins old, crumbled, decayed, moldering dust, dead men's graves, grim death, decayed again. That language is all there, and the green, the ivy is the kind of hope. So it's a hopeful poem, but it's a hopeful poem that you're reciting as I'm listening to you do within all those phrases, though. So it's a very melancholic kind of, hope, right?
It's fitting to be written by a clergyman
Yes.
because it's about the vanity of this world.
Yes. And what you look for beyond. Yeah. Well, it was a very, very popular poem too. As you said, there was at least 6 or 7, musical, versions of this were out there that people could get, and there were also parodies of it. There were several parodies that I found. One of them is like a newspaper parody about reading their paper. There was one about someone smoking a pipe, like old men smoking these long clay pipes. So there's several parodies actually of this out there too. Odd. I mean, this little poem that almost no one knows now, unless you read Pickwick Papers, would know of this thing, had a kind of cultural moment for decades. People recognize this poem as being something from Dickens. So that's the ivy green from the Clergyman. And then also when he's done, he has to repeat the lines a second time so Mr. Snodgrass can write them down. And we're still being reminded of this over and over. I don't think this continues throughout, but I think still in the beginning here, Dickens is very aware of the conceit of this, that these guys are going around and writing everything down. So we keep getting reminded of that. And then he's, because of this, Mr. Pickwick asks him, "Oh, do you have any stories you can tell us?" And Wardles says, "Why don't you tell him the story of John Edmonds?" "Oh, of course, John Edmonds." It's just odd that Dickens is like, I don't feel like writing. I don't feel like getting along with the story. Let me just tell another story instead of getting along with my characters or doing something. So let's have another story. And it's the convict's return. And it begins, it's interesting enough, it begins when I first settled in this village, said the old gentleman, the clergyman. So, and he talks about how he settled here and he knew this family, the name of Edmonds, and what's interesting for me about it is that the clergyman himself is the narrator. It's this tunnel, right? We're being narrated a story, and here's someone in the story, and then he starts to narrate a story. But even in his story, he's the narrator, just as Bose is the narrator in the rest of the book. This little story has to have a narrator too. The Stroller's Tale had the same thing, that he was telling the tale, and he was in the story himself. And Dickens has this is the way stories are told, that it's the narrator is always a presence. This is something that goes away in fiction after Dickens. Other people do it still while in the mid-19th century, but by the end of the century, we're getting almost entirely third-person omniscient, narrators, and the narrator kind of stops being a character in works. Narrator is always a character in Dickens novels.
Well, I feel like this is something that the modernists are very much trying to revive. And then you get even postmodern novels that love to have the unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
We're having to piece together what we think really happened because our narrators can't be relied on to actually tell us the truth.
Yeah. Well, this story is another story of a drunkard and a no good, like the Stroller's Tale was. Edmonds is a cruel man. He beats his wife. And just like the wife in the Stroller's Tale, she endures this. She's cruelly as he had treated her. She had loved him once, and the recollections of what he had been to her awakened feelings of forbearance and meekness under suffering in her bosom. So she's willing to endure this. She's that kind of figure. And the son, who seems like he'll be with his mom and take care of her, then he winds up turning out wild. gets involved in a robbery eventually, and then it is, is caught and sentenced to death, tried and condemned to die. The mother's upset. The sentence winds up getting commuted to transportation. Before he leaves, she visits him every day in jail. Then she doesn't show up one day, and 2 days, 3 days. And then he finally breaks and repents when he's in jail waiting for transportation. He doesn't know that she dies, right? And then he goes off to Australia. He comes back years later. Was it 14 years later? I don't know. 14 years he's transported. And then he comes back after his sentence. No one recognizes him in the town as he comes back to his town as an older man. He had set foot in the village he had left with shame and disgrace 17 years before. The place awakens associations of his earliest days when he was happy, but nothing is the same. His old house, it says he looked around him, nothing was changed, but yet he was not a part of it anymore. And this is all for me connecting to what I was talking about earlier about this kind of connection with the past that continues and how that creates our happy moments that Wardle was talking about. And here it's someone who has become disconnected in that string of happy moments, and now he can't get it back. He took a turn in his life that he cannot get this back again. And that's kind of part of the I think tragedy of this story. Well, he finally sees his father out in the field here. And everybody had forgotten him. He passes an unknown. He sees his house, and there's a little happy family living there now. And then he sees this old man, dissipated. It says from the effect of, it looked old, but more the effect of dissipation or disease than the length of years. And it's his father. He recognizes him right off the bat. You want to read that end of that story? That "Stand off," shrieked the old man.
"Stand off," shrieked the old man. Furious with terror, he raised his stick and struck Edmonds a heavy blow across the face. "Father, devil!" murmured the convict between his set teeth. He rushed wildly forward and clenched the old man by the throat. But he was his father, and his arm fell powerless by his side. The old man uttered a loud yell, which rang through the lonely fields like the howl of an evil spirit. His face turned black. The gore rushed from his mouth and nose and dyed the grass a deep dark red as he staggered and fell. He had ruptured a blood vessel, and he was a dead man before his son could raise him from that thick, sluggish pool. "In that corner of the churchyard," said the old gentleman, after a silence of a few moments, "in that corner of the churchyard of which I have before spoken, there lies buried a man who was in my employment for 3 years after this event, and who is truly contrite, penitent, and humbled, if ever man was. No one save myself knew in that man's lifetime who he was and whence he came. It was John Edmonds, the returned convict."
Well done. Yeah, this, idea that, a grim ending too. They attack each other, but but the father just dies anyway. So it's not as if we don't get patricide going on here, but he wants to kill him. That idea too, that it's a tragedy, and you can't get back what you leave. In this story is what he said. You can't go home again. If you've gone off on such rotten terms, you might not get it back. And
But he does spend those last 3 years of his life working for the clergyman.
Yeah.
And
contrite, penitent. Oh yeah, he can be penitent and go on, and he can have his future reward. But he seems to be not able to have the reward in the world as well. So it's a great clergyman's tale. That's what he, that's your reward, but not now. So I had a message we were off again. So
oh no, that's not good.
Do you want to check?
Sure. Are we still going? So my beloved in the next room says that she can still hear it. So
okay,
I guess we're still going.
Good. Well, we'll just keep going, and hopefully that everything will work out in the end. Maybe you and I just have to record a whole show just by ourselves and replace it with this. But this will be a test run then, a rehearsal.
All right.
Well, let me take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Dickens lovers worldwide. If you would like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You can also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And a Rosenbach membership also makes a great gift. So, and thank you everyone who has become a member and has joined. I know there have been some since the beginning of Pickwick Monthly. You can also join us on the Facebook group page, Pickwick Monthly, for lots more info, news, links, conversations, and fun. And if you're not yet registered for this, go to the Rosenbach website and register for Pickwick Monthly. That way I will send you emails every month about what's coming up and more information and links as well. I also want to thank this month all the good wishes in the emails as I recovered for a week after being ill and had to postpone this show for 1 week. It is always happy. I am always happy to hear from our Pickwick audience. Some of you have been emailing me frequently anyway. I'll call out Bernice, Henrietta, Adam. I love getting emails from you all. But if anyone has a question or comment about the serial part for the month or just Dickens in general, don't hesitate to drop me a line at the Rosenbach. It's Pettit, EPETTIT, at rosenbach.org. On to chapter 7, we hope. How Mr. Winkle, instead of shooting at the pigeon and killing the crow, shot at the crow and wounded the pigeon. How the Dingley Dell Cricket Club played All-Muggleton, and how All-Muggleton dined at the Dingley Dell Expense, with other interesting and instructive matters. I like a nice long chapter title, don't you, James?
Yes. I actually think I prefer the next chapter's title, but
that is that's well played, that one. But yeah, this chapter begins with this kind of, it's like this pastoral setting that's lovely, that doesn't seem to be satiric as he's been all through this novel. Suddenly we get this, Mr. Pickwick wakes up. He was no sluggard, and he sprang like an ardent warrior from his tent bedstead. I mean, that's satiric in himself about Mr. Pickwick. But then pleasant country. And then, he's looking out the window and sees how lovely everything is and comments on that. And then the rich, sweet smell of the hay ricks, the perfumes of the little flower garden scented the air. He fell into an enchanting and delicious reverie. It's Dingley Dell, and it's lovely to be there. And not everything in this story is going to be Dickens making fun of what's going on around. Matter of fact, this kind of part about it, like the pastoral scenes, the places in the country, Dickens really seems to admire and wants us to recognize how lovely this life is. And this is why these city guys want to go out there too, I guess.
But as we're about to find out, Mr. Winkle is not perhaps as great a huntsman as he has led others to believe.
Well, he's supposed to be the sportsman of the group
Yes.
here, right? So, Tupman's the lover, Snodgrass the poet, and Winkle is the sportsman. And Mr. Wardle calls Mr. Pickwick down, and he says, your friend and I are going out rook shooting before breakfast. He's a very good shot, ain't he? I heard him say he's a capital one, replied Mr. Pickwick, but I never saw him aim at anything. So Winkle has told Pickwick and the other Pickwickians that he is quite the shot, but obviously he hasn't. And we know that he certainly wasn't a shot in the duel either. Mr. Wardle tells Joe, the fat boy, to go get, the gentleman. And the boy departed. And then the boy departed to execute his commission, and the host, carrying both guns like a second Robinson Crusoe. Have to mention the Crusoe reference here, right? I mean, this is the second Robinson Crusoe reference in this book in the first 7 chapters. The other one was to Alexander Selkirk, the master of always surveyed, Robinson Crusoe. And now this one, Dickens loves Robinson Crusoe. So I don't know. I think there are a couple novels that don't contain a Crusoe reference, but almost all of them do. And Dickens loves this story. So that was that popular that throughout, his entire life. Everybody, if you didn't read Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, you read one of the gazillion adaptations of it, of which there were, and there were a lot of them
on stage.
Yeah, or saw it on stage, and there were a lot of adaptations written in words of one syllable. Meaning they were written for young readers or people learning how to read. Very popular book with Dickens as well. So the fat boy, in not being quite certain which gentleman he was directed to call, had with peculiar sagacity and to prevent the possibility of any mistake, called them all. So they all come out, and Winkle is a little nervous here. He says, responded with a forced smile, took up the spare gun with an expression of countenance which a metaphysical rook, impressed with the foreboding of his approaching death by violence, may be supposed to assume. It might have been keenness, but it looked remarkably like misery. Winkle is looking like the birds he is about to shoot. That this is not going to come off well. Well, the way you hunt for rooks, which is a black bird, it's in that Corvidae family with ravens and crows. The boy shakes a branch, and then they all take off, and that's what happens here. Half a dozen young rooks in violent conversation flew out to ask what the matter was. The old gentleman fired by way of reply. Down fell one bird and off flew the others. Take him up, Joe, said the old gentleman. Now it's Winkle's turn. And why don't you read Mr. Winkle Advanced? Oh, no, I'll have you read the second part. Because first he goes to shoot and everybody kind of like ducks, like he's going to shoot, but it doesn't go off, right? Missed fire. Forgets to put the cap in.
Well, that's some of the best humor there.
Because, we'll read it then.
Yeah. So Mr. Winkle advanced and leveled his gun. Mr. Pickwick and his friends cowered involuntarily to escape damage from the heavy fall of rooks, which they felt quite certain would be occasioned by the devastating barrel of their friend. There was a solemn pause, a shout, a flapping of wings, a faint click.
Hello, said the old gentleman.
Won't it go? Inquired Mr. Pickwick. Missed fire, said Mr. Winkle, who was very pale, probably from disappointment.
Yes,
So,
he has forgotten the cap.
yeah.
And that is funny. I've forgotten that passage. Yeah.
He's such an incompetent sportsman that he doesn't even remember the cap, doesn't even remember some very elementary things that are necessary when you're going out shooting. But to me, the funniest thing is everybody else's reaction.
Yes.
They just assume that there's going to be this torrential downpour of rooks that he's going to shoot with one shot.
Well, he doesn't. The slight omission was rectified. This time, the boy shouted, 4 birds flew out. Mr. Winkle fired. There was a scream as of an individual, not a rook, in corporal anguish. Mr. Tupman had saved the lives of innumerable unoffending birds by receiving a portion of the charge in his left arm. So Tupman gets hit this time instead of one of the birds. He calls distractedly upon some feminine Christian name, and then opened first one eye, then the other, then fell back and shut them both. I'm assuming the feminine Christian name is Rachel.
Yes.
That he has uttered. They gather him up. Mr. Pickwick is angry too, so he calls him a wretch for this. So, but they carry him back to the house. The spinster aunt appeared. She smiled and beckoned them to walk quicker. 'Twas evident she knew not of the disaster. Poor thing, there are times when ignorance is bliss indeed. And then, but when she sees him, she uttered a piercing scream, burst into an hysteric laugh, and fell backwards into the arms of her nieces. We get these, melodramatic histrionics that are, just people being ridiculous. And is he dead? Is he? Ha ha ha! Here she bursts into a fit number 2 of hysteric laughter, interspersed with screams. But Mr. Tupman, calm yourself. And then, it is his voice. And then, oh, say you are not dead. And they go through this, mummery here. And he's fine, but he's going to get to be with her. He closes his eyes. He sleeps. Dear, dear, dear Mr. Tupman. But he jumps up. Oh, say those words again. He's like, surely you did not hear them. Oh, yes, I did. And, and then she's going to take care of him. They dress his wound. Mr. Pickwick alone was silent and reserved. Doubt and distrust were exhibited in his countenance. His confidence in Mr. Winkle had been shaken, greatly shaken by the proceedings of the morning. So he's starting to realize that maybe Mr. Winkle's not quite the sportsman that he said he was. So, well, Mr. Wardle, not missing a beat. Are you a cricketer? Inquired Mr. Wardle of the marksman. At other times, Mr. Winkle would have replied in the affirmative. He felt the delicacy of his situation and modestly replied, no. So, Winkle has learned his lesson, right?
After that last incident, for him to try to pretend to be a sportsman now would really be tempting trouble.
Well, there's a cricket match. The grand match is played today, I believe, said Mr. Pickwick. It is, of course, you would like to see it. And off they go without Tupman. He's going to remain behind in the good hands of the ladies, but really Aunt Rachel. And he'll remain behind, and the rest of them will go off to see that trial of skill which had roused all Muggleton from its torpor and inoculated Dingley Dell with a fever of excitement. And they head off to Muggleton for the cricket match. And then we get another place that they're in here. We had a description of Rochester when the Pickwickians arrived there. Now we get another town that they're into, and this is it says Muggleton is a corporate town with a mayor, burgesses, and freemen. A little later, it says Muggleton is an ancient and loyal borough, but that kind of incorporated town, I had to look it up a little bit. It's not only the difference between the British and American kind of system, but it's also 19th century. But towns are incorporated. And that kind of means also that the ultimate, that ancient loyal borough, that it is of long standing. It has all the things. It's like where I live. I live in a place called Jenkintown right outside of Philadelphia, and it's a borough. And it's actually the smallest independently operated borough in the state of Pennsylvania. We're a half square mile, but we have a mayor, council, our own police department, all of that stuff. And because we are a borough, in a sense, we're incorporated. So, but Muggleton is mingling a zealous advocacy of Christian principles with a devoted attachment to commercial rights, is the way Dickens describes this. They're against slavery, but they're in favor of factories. They're in favor of church livings, but they're against Sunday trade.
Which ties into Sunday Under Three Heads.
It does. So this idea that this is a town that Dickens is describing, as he's seen all these towns, especially as he's been traveling around covering elections for papers, these towns that they're very Christian, but they're also very interested in making money. I love the against slavery, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're so much, kind of, non-racist. It's just that slavery doesn't help factory towns. They're in favor of factories. That's their economy. They're okay with the church making money off selling, livings for people. It's okay for the church to be commercial as well, right? But Sunday, that's, trade should end because it's time to pray. That's the hypocritical part that he kind of keys in here. It's okay for the church to make money selling livings, but it's not okay for the people to make money on Sunday. And that's what one of the things he's writing about, because it's also in Sunday Under Three Heads. I mean, Dickens imagines this world where this cricket match can't happen if it's Sunday. Also, in a sense, I get the idea that Dickens is kind of setting up this, town as being this is for him a kind of almost like an ordinary small town, biggish, because there's a factory in England. This is just as Dingley Dell is this kind of, old world pastoral place with the squire or Wardle running it, and this is like what the towns look like to him. But what they're really going for is the cricket match. And let's get to the cricket match. The Dingley Dellers and All-Muggletonians. And everybody's wearing their straw hats, flannel jackets, and white trousers. The cricketing costume, not only the cricketers, but everybody that goes to watch cricket wears these too. I'm not a cricket aficionado. I do not really, understand the game. I mean, I just know the very rudimentary basics of it. But it's a game that Dickens loved, and obviously it's very big British game. When they're there, though, before we get to the first illustration of the cricketers, we'll do that first, because they're being described here playing their game. They begin, and this is the first of the illustrations from Bus. And let me show this picture. And here is the first illustration from
Aha.
R.W. Buss. That up there. Dingley Dell and All-Muggletonian up here on the banner. I think he's hit it and the ball has knocked his cap off right here.
That's what it looks like. Yeah.
I mean, they're pretty close and not going to be that close in cricket, are they? So I don't know exactly what's going on. I mean, why they would be this close. It's just a funny scene. And it doesn't seem all that well executed. I mean, the detail here is not very good at all. And apparently that's not because of Buss's inability to have well-detailed illustrations, that it falls into the etching part, right? And it does say drawn and etched by Buss, but he had difficulty doing it, and he had to have help with it as well. But I didn't know this. Apparently, this picture, though, survives, even though it was pulled out after the first printings and not printed again. It survives in what, James?
The 10-pound note for a while. There were a couple of years in the 1990s in which the reverse side of the 10-pound note looked like this.
There you go. And they reversed the image.
Yeah.
And, but it's essentially the same image. The cricket match, Dingley Dell against All-Muggleton from the Pickwick Papers, 1836.
Yeah.
An odd illustration, like you're honoring Dickens, and I don't think people think Charles Dickens, cricket, Pickwick paper. Like that's not the first thing that comes to your mind, right? And yet that's what they chose for the money. And on top of that, they chose the one illustrator who, this is it. It's just these get two pictures in all of Dickens. Very unusual choice. I'll have to research this 10-pound note and see when this was all, or do you know any more about it?
Not really. And as I said, it was just made for a couple of years in the 90s. And, you know, in Britain, they like to change their money very frequently.
Oh, do they?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
And in fact, it will cease to become legal tender after a certain time. And so if you bring back money from the UK and then years later return and try to spend that money, you will sometimes get very odd looks because after a while, it stops being accepted. You have to go to the bank and then return it, and then they will give you the modern currency. I believe this has to do with trying to prevent counterfeiters, that if you have a rapid turnover in the designs for your currency, I think the thinking is it becomes more difficult for counterfeiters to come in and make counterfeit notes. Yeah, if you were to go to Britain today and had one of these 10-pound notes and tried to spend it, you would probably be directed to find a bank and see if you can exchange it, because they wouldn't accept it. There are people who collect them. And I got this image from a coin collecting site that, you can buy these sort of on the side from people who are just interested in collecting past coins and banknotes.
Well, I'm just fascinated that they used a Buss illustration for the money. It's just really unusual.
Yeah,
but good for Buss. Hey, he got dumped, but hey, his is the illustration that made it on the 10-pound note. So good for him.
I imagine it had more to do with the fact that it was showing cricket, showing this national game. So for your national currency to have something that is representative of England for something that has been issued by the Bank of England made sense.
All righty. Well, They're at the cricket match and they hear someone speaking. Capital game, smart sport, fine exercise, very. It's the green-coated friend of the Rochester coach, Mr. Pickwick realizes. And they hear him again, this way, capital fun, lots of beer, hogsheads, rounds of beef, bullocks, mustard, cartloads, glorious day, down with you, make yourself at home, glad to see you, very. I mean, he is this is, the green-coated stranger whose name we will find out momentarily, at his best. This really fun way of speaking that makes him so memorable as he's greeting Mr. Pickwick there. Mr. Pickwick is surprised to see him. How did he get here? He says, come, stopping at Crown at Muggleton, at a party, flannel jackets, white trousers, anchovy sandwiches, deviled kidney, splendid fellows, glorious. He had converted by a process peculiar to himself into that extent of good fellowship on which a general invitation may be easily founded. I mean, this is his life, good fellowship, and he'll get an invitation. If, he's, happy enough to meet people, they will invite him along to wine and dine with them. And that's what he gets to keep doing. They, of course, will have they're watching the game. It's a lot of fun here. We get some real cricket. I'm sure cricketers love that, or do they? I'm sure cricketers love this passage, all the detail about them playing, Dumpkins and Potter on the one side, and Luffy and who's the other on the other. But the Muggletonians are just, wrecking them. In just a few paragraphs, we get, the destruction of the Dingley Dellers. Dingley Dell gave in and allowed the superior prowess of All-Muggleton. And the stranger in the green coat, meanwhile, had been eating, drinking, and talking without cessation. And of course, he has a cricket story from himself. Wardle asks him, you have played it, sir? Played it? Think I have, thousands of times, not here. West Indies. And then he has this glorious story. You're gonna read his quick cricket story there?
Warm, red hot, scorching, glowing. Played a match once, single wicket, friend of the Colonel, Sir Thomas Blazo, who should get the greatest number of runs. Won the toss, first innings, 7:00 a.m., 6 natives to look out. Went in, kept in, heat intense, natives all fainted, taken away. Fresh, half dozen ordered, fainted also. Blazo bowling, supported by 2 natives, couldn't bowl me out, fainted too, cleared away the Colonel, wouldn't give in faithful attendant. Quanko Samba, last man left, sun so hot, bat in blisters, ball, scorched brown, 570 runs, rather exhausted. Quanko mustered up last remaining strength, bowled me out, had a bath, and went out to dinner.
And what became of what's his name, sir?
Blazo?
No, the other gentleman.
Quanko Samba.
Yes, sir.
Poor Quanko never recovered it. Bowled on mine account, bowled off on his own, died, sir. Here the stranger buried his countenance in a brown jug, but whether to hide his emotion or imbibe its contents, we cannot distinctly affirm. We only know that he paused suddenly, drew a long and deep breath, and looked anxiously on as 2 of the principal members of the Dingley Dell Club approached Mr. Pickwick and said, "We are about to partake of a plain dinner at the Blue Lion, sir. We hope you and your friends will join us."
And they do. With that, I just poured a new beer. So a Shandygaff I'm drinking today, beer and ginger ale.
Excellent.
Well, it's so hot, people are dying, at least in the West Indies, cricket match. Another, story from from the stranger in the green coat, whose name we find out now. Of course, said Mr. Wardle, among our friends, we include Mr. And he looked towards the stranger.
Jingle. Jingle, Alfred Jingle, Esquire of No Hall, Nowhere.
That's great. I should introduce myself as that. Edward G. Pettit of No Hall, Nowhere. So there we go. We finally have a name for him. Why do you think it took? What is the? Is he finally named here because Dickens knows he's going to continue with him, and that he didn't name him before because I don't know.
Yeah, these are his carefree memless days. Later on, he kept these memoranda he referred to as his mems that would sketch out what he planned to happen in each chapter. But when he was writing Pickwick Papers, he didn't keep those memoranda around, probably because he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do.
Well, but it's interesting because early on, there's a letter to he mentions in a letter to his wife that about Jingle, and he's going to make quite a hit. That he understands, and this is after he's first introduced him. So he does have in his head that this is a character that I could really use.
Yeah.
But he waits till, the second time in, and then almost the end of this first scene before he finally gives him a name, which is unusual, I find.
Well, one of the things that makes him so distinctive is that vocal pattern that allows him to be recognized without a name.
Yeah, true.
And so when he shows up again, we immediately recognize him, even though we can't name him. He's just the guy that talks that way.
Mm-hmm. And the name he gives him, of course, then turns out to be musical. A name, a term that, you associate with sound, Jingle. And,
it's the perfect name for this character.
He is. So, well, Alfred Jingle, we can call him that now, goes off with everyone because Jingle's always getting invited. That is his mission in life, is to meet people and get invited to their parties. And he always succeeds. And here they go off to the Blue Lion Inn in Muggleton, where there are substantial viands on the table and everybody eats as much as possible. And then the bottles, glasses, and dessert are placed on the table. And this is grand fun, especially now as the toasts begin, which is a very ordinary occurrence in, life here in England at this time, and had been in America for a long time as well, for the meal to be finished. And then suddenly somebody comes up and will make a toast, and then somebody else. And then it's just a succession of toasts to the end. And no one walks out steadily after a dinner like this. And Mr. Luffy and Mr. Staple here, and I forget which one gives the first. I think it's Mr. Staple. And it's a very hyperbolic toast speech to the other cricket players, in which the kind of the honors of the cricket field are also, the honors of the world. That he's, it's as if he's, toasting someone who is, it's like he's toasting Wellington here, right? Instead of, Luffy on the cricket field, or Dumpkins. I love the way it's set out here. We won't read the whole thing, but it is, I love the way Dickens sets this out, because he has it's his speech. I thank my honorable friend, if you allow him to call him so. And then in parentheses, we get this incessant stage directions is what we're getting, right? 4 heres and 1 certainly for Mr. Jingle. Cheers here, vociferous cheering, cheers, enthusiasm, great applause. All through, we get stage directions through this. And I like that little touch here, that the theatricality of Dickens and how he's able to bring this, bring the sound of this speech to the readers in just reading it, and having all this kind of interruptions of cheers and applause going on throughout it. And other toasts were drunk. Mr. Luffy, Mr. Struggles, Pickwick, Mr. Jingle. Everybody gets toasted in their turn, and then the result, though, is that enthusiastic as we are in the noble cause to which we have devoted ourselves, we should have felt a sensation of pride which we cannot express, and a consciousness of having done something to merit immortality, of which we are now deprived, could we have laid the faintest outline on these addresses before our ardent readers. Mr. Snodgrass, as usual, took a great mass of notes, which would no doubt have afforded most useful and valuable information, had not the burning eloquence of the words or the feverish influence of the wine made that gentleman's hand so extremely unsteady as to render his writing nearly unintelligible and his style wholly so. It was either the feverish influence of the wine or the burning eloquence of the words of the toasts. And I think we can be assured it was the wine. That Snodgrass's notes are illegible. A few words, they say, bowl, sparkling, ruby, bright wine, but then they can't read the rest of it. So I think that's very funny that's how that finished up, the end here. Dickens making the nod that these men are taking notes here. Clearly, in the drinking scenes, their notes aren't going to come out right. And the whole dinner ends with them when the Dingley Dell and the Muggletonians all heard to sing with great feeling and emphasis the beautiful and pathetic national air of "We won't go home till morning." We won't go home till morning. We won't go home till morning, till daylight doth appear. So the pathetic national air of a drunken song to finish the time at the Blue Lion Inn of Muggleton. Chapter 8, our final chapter. With
Strongly illustrative of the position that the course of true love is not a railway.
Yes, I like that. I like that nod to that kind of, the kind of future, the railway, things, go fast and strong on a railway, but this isn't a novel where Dickens is has no interest in that. That he set this back in the world of coaches, not railways, and that's suitable for the course of love, as will happen here with Tracy Tupman and Aunt Rachel. Well, they're still home waiting for the gentleman. Tupman is there. The young ladies were pretty, their manners winning, their dispositions unexceptionable. But there was a dignity in the air, a touch-me-notishness. That's a great phrase, huh? A touch-me-notishness in the walk, a majesty in the eye of the spinster aunt to which at their time of life they could lay no claim, which distinguished her from any female on whom Mr. Tupman had ever gazed. So he is in love with Aunt Rachel. She says she has forgotten to water her flowers outside, and he says, "Water them now," in accents of persuasion, and she leads him out to the garden. Just the two of them, no chaperones.
So, to the bower.
Yes, the bower. And bowers, of course, read that there. There
was a bower at the further end with honeysuckle, jessamine, and creeping plants, one of those sweet retreats which humane men erect for the accommodation of spiders.
Yes. So as we all know, you have these little that still happens. Little outdoor thing there. You go out, spiders all over it. You can leave it for a couple days. Well, they're out there, and it begins. The lovemaking scene begins. And it's this funny cliched, you're an angel, and all women are angels, and they're it's like they're right off the stage here. Could such an individual be found, said the lady. But he can be found, said the ardent Mr. Tupman, interposing. He is found. He is here, Miss Wardle. And ere the lady was aware of his intention, Mr. Tupman had sunk upon his knees at her feet. Say you love me, and they go on. And then read Mr. Tupman no sooner heard this avowal.
Mr. Tupman no sooner heard this avowal than he proceeded to do what his enthusiastic emotions prompted, and what, for aught we know, for we are but little acquainted with such matters, people so circumstanced always do. He jumped up and, throwing his arm round the neck of the spinster aunt, imprinted upon her lips numerous kisses, which, after a due show of struggling and resistance, she received so passively that there is no telling how many more Mr. Tupman might have bestowed if the lady had not given a very unaffected start and exclaimed in an affrighted tone, Mr. Tupman, we are observed, we are discovered. Mr. Tupman looked round. There was the fat boy, perfectly motionless, with his large circular eyes staring into the arbor, but without the slightest expression on his face that the most expert physiognomist could have referred to astonishment, curiosity, or any other known passion that agitates the human breast. Mr. Tupman gazed on the fat boy, and the fat boy stared at him, and the longer Mr. Tupman observed the utter vacancy of the fat boy's countenance, the more convinced he became that he either did not know or did not understand anything that had been going forward. Under this impression, he said with great firmness, "What do you want here, sir?" "Supper's ready, sir," was the prompt reply. "Have you just come here, sir?" inquired Mr. Tupman with a piercing look. "Just," replied the fat boy. Mr. Tupman looked at him very hard again, but there was not a wink in his eye or a curve in his face. Mr. Tupman took the arm of the spinster aunt and walked towards the house. The fat boy followed behind. "He knows nothing of what has happened," he whispered. "Nothing," said the spinster aunt. There was a sound behind them as of an imperfectly suppressed chuckle. Mr. Tupman turned sharply round. No, it could not have been the fat boy. There was not a gleam of mirth or anything but feeding in his whole visage. "He must have been fast asleep," whispered Mr. Tupman. "I have not the least doubt of it," replied the spinster aunt. They both laughed heartily. Mr. Tupman was wrong. The fat boy, for once, had not been fast asleep. He was awake, wide awake, to what had been going forward.
That's where we'll leave it. Let us see these scenes as illustrated. First will be the
bus,
the original RW bus illustration,
which is such a product of the 1830s. Look at those gigantic sleeves she's got. Sort of when they had expanded to their fullest point, they're later going to sort of collapse. When you get into the 1840s, you don't see that so much. But they actually had to have special undergarments to fill out those giant sleeves.
And he's right next to the mirror. I mean, they turn there. He's standing right here watching what's going on here. More detail and certainly more interesting than the cricket match picture. So remember, his arm's in a sling here. He's only got one arm around her, and here's his hand on her waist. And neither one is portrayed as, young, beautiful, as, they believe, as they are in their own eyes, at least. And now let's look at here is the Phiz remake of it. He gives us much more detail, especially in the background here in the house. Everything seems to be a little more detailed, but again, that's also, that could be evident of better etching, that all this detail has come through.
Well, Brown was very skilled at doing his own steel etchings.
Yeah.
Whereas Buss, being a wood engraver, just wasn't as used to doing that.
I love here how the arm isn't in the sling.
No.
It's not so injured that he can't use it to embrace her. He has pulled the arm out, which is nowhere in the text. So this is a little note from Phiz that, like, he's actually can use his arm. So let's look at them both together here, just to kind of get he's reversed them, the perspective, and it's also given him, this kind of extra here to have this background of the house.
The arm of Tupman in Buss's illustration looks maybe just a little bit too long, to be able to get his whole hand around her there.
Well, she looks odd too, the way her hands come out here.
Yeah.
The proportions are a little unusual. Yeah, sorry, Buss, we didn't love your work. But
and I love how in Phiz's illustration, Tupman is a bit on the portly side, and Rachel is contrastingly sort of this skinny, bony looking woman, and I love her hair.
I like the curls springing off her head.
Yeah. It's just a much more comedic
and
illustration.
A rake just waiting for somebody to step on it right here. So this is somebody stand up, please, and step on the rake, but he won't. So that's not how the text ends, but it wouldn't be bad. So, all righty, let's stop the share there. The fat boy gives no indication that he is aware of what he has seen here, but then we get that chuckle. Did he chuckle? Oh, of course not. He's just completely blank the whole time. But we learned that for once, the fat boy has not been fast asleep. So.
And Joe was such a popular character that I brought in. I have a set of Dickens tumblers. And most of the novels are not represented at all in this set of tumblers, but Pickwick Papers gets two, both Mr. Pickwick and Joe, who I guess was sort of rivaling Pickwick himself in popularity for quite some time.
He's a very popular figure for people to illustrate and put on things, and as it's even from all the cups and illustrations. It's Pickwick, and it's both Sam Weller and his father and the fat boy. They seem to be the biggest ones, and then I think Jingle comes in close to them, but they're the ones that appear on everything at the time. So
why Tony Weller? I'm not quite.
I know he's enormously popular.
Yeah.
And we haven't gotten them yet in the book, but even Fat Boy, like, we'll have in these kinds of scenes, but you've seen exactly what the Fat Boy scenes are like. This is it. Yeah. And there's only a few of them. And yet that character himself kind of really takes off. And it's Dickens' power of crafting, I think, a small character with very little, with just a few details that really make it ring, that people remember this character. And they certainly did then. Well, It's getting late there. 11, 12, 1 o'clock had struck. The gentlemen had not arrived. They went out to the Pickwick and Snodgrass and Winkle, and Mr. Wardle himself, and are out at this party. They have not come home yet. Everybody's worried. Were they robbed? And coming home at night. And they finally arrive. Mr. Pickwick, with his hands in his pockets and his hat cocked completely over his left eye, was leaning against the dresser, shaking his head from side to side and producing a constant succession of the blandest and most benevolent smiles, without being moved thereunto by any discernible cause or pretense whatsoever. Old Mr. Wardle, with a highly inflamed countenance, was grasping the hand of a strange gentleman, muttering protestations of eternal friendship. Mr. Winkle, supporting himself by the 8-day clock, was feebly invoking destruction upon the head of any member of the family who should suggest the propriety of his retiring for the night. And Mr. Snodgrass had sunk into a chair with an expression of the most abject and hopeless misery that the human mind can imagine, portrayed in every lineament of his expressive face. So they have returned home drunk, and then we will share the picture for that, which is the
Drunk? How dare you, sir? How dare you? It was the salmon.
It was the salmon. Here they are. Mr. Pickwick is described here leaning. Snodgrass. Which Snodgrass is in the chair? There's Winkle on the clock, and there's Jingle and Mr. Wardle shaking hands. Is anything the matter? Inquired the three ladies. Nothing the matter, replied Mr. Pickwick. We're all right. I say, Wardle, we're all right, ain't we? And he says they are. And then we get a little jingle. Cricket dinner, glorious party, capital songs, old port, claret, good, very good, wine, ma'am, wine. And then the line from Snodgrass, right? It wasn't the wine, murmured Mr. Snodgrass in a broken voice. It was the salmon. Somehow or other, it is never the wine in these cases. So it wasn't the wine, it was the salmon that affected them in such a manner. So they want to get them to bed. Of course, no living boy shall carry me, said Mr. Pickwick stoutly, and he went on smiling as before. Let's have another bottle, cried Winkle, but then he fell fast asleep, so that's not going to happen. What a shocking scene, said the spinster aunt. Disgusting, dreadful, dreadful, said Jingle. Horrible, horrid spectacle, very. What a nice man, whispered the spinster aunt to Mr. Tupman. Good looking, too, whispered Emily Wardle. Oh, decidedly, observed the spinster aunt. Mr. Tupman felt that as Jingle's popularity increased, he retired further into the shade. A little jealousy right off the bat. Jingle's got to walk into a room, and all the women notice him. And Tupman is a little worried that this is going to affect him. It will.
Yeah.
Let's get to the last part of this chapter. He begins to get jealous. The next day, the old lady's habit on a fine summer morning was to go repair to the arbor, and the fat boy follows her. And instead of leaving the arbor to walk a few paces out of it, he would look carefully around him in every direction and return towards her with great stealth and an air of the most profound mystery. This behavior is unusual behavior of Joe walking out and stealthily creeping back towards her. Gave the impression that the bloated lad was about to do her some grievous bodily harm with the view of possessing himself of her loose coins. And then he starts shouting in her ear, Missus. And then we find out Jingle is walking in the garden close, and he's listening to what's going on. Well, Joe, I'm sure I have been a good mistress to you, Joe. You have invariably been treated very kindly. You have never had too much to do, and you have always had enough to eat. She's worried that he's going to murder her at this point. And his response is yes. And he says, I wants to make your flesh creep. This sounded like a very bloodthirsty mode of showing one's gratitude to the old lady. And then he says what he means. Making her flesh creep means that he's going to tell her this story of what he saw her daughter Rachel doing. And when he starts, he says, the strange gentleman, him has had his arm hurt, a kissing and hugging. Who, Joe? None of the servants, I hope. Worse than that. Not one of my granddaughters. Worse than that. Worse than that, Joe. Who was it, Joe? Miss Rachel. What? Speak louder. Miss Rachel, roared the boy. My daughter! And she suffered him? And I saw her kissing of him again. And this is the worst thing. Without my permission, at her time of life, miserable old woman like me might have waited till I was dead. You'd think she'd be happy that her spinster daughter finally has, made a match here.
But it's without her permission.
Without her permission.
Where is she?
Some strange gentleman had just showed up the house 2 days before. Well, it was, that's what is going to make her flesh creep. And it does. She's very upset by this. And Jingle, hearing this, it says it was a remarkable coincidence, perhaps, but it was nevertheless a fact that Mr. Jingle, within 5 minutes of his arrival at Manor Farm on the preceding night, had inwardly resolved to lay siege to the heart of the spinster aunt without delay. Jingle knows this is the one. Don't go for the young ones. Go for the spinster aunt. Her heart will be easier to win, and maybe she has some money besides, right? And then we get, at the end of this paragraph, Fielding tells us that man is fire and woman tow, and the prince of darkness sets a light to him. Mr. Jingle knew that young men to spinster aunts are as lighted gas to gunpowder, and he determined to essay the effect of an explosion without loss of time. Now, I read that, as I know you did too, and I thought, Fielding, that's
Henry Fielding.
Henry Fielding, of course, great 18th century novelist. Dickens loves Fielding so much, he named one of his sons Henry Fielding Dickens.
Yep.
So anytime I see a reference to Fielding in here, I'm thinking that's who he's referring. Apparently not. And I only learned this through the Penguin edition with the Mark Wormold notes in the back, that this is actually Thomas Fielding wrote a book called Select Proverbs of All Nations. And this is the cover to that book. Select Proverbs of All Nations, illustrated with notes and comments, to which is added a summary of ancient pastimes, holidays, and customs, with an analysis of the wisdom of the ancients and of the church, fathers of the church, the whole arranged on a new plan. 1824, Thomas Fielding. I have no idea who Thomas Fielding is. He is not in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. He is, I have found, all I can find about Thomas Fielding is that he wrote this, or edited this book, the Select Proverbs of All Nations. I don't think he's related to Henry Fielding, but apparently this book had a couple reviews. It's got a couple references to it in the 19th century after it was published, but it doesn't seem to have been like this monster bestseller that everybody would have known. But apparently Dickens knows it at the time, and I guess it had some cachet still then by 1836. And he quotes that proverb from it, which is, there it is. And he quotes that proverb from it, that man is fire and woman tow, the devil comes and sets them all in a blaze. So it is strange, but there we have it. So That's the Fielding reference. And someone wrote to me and asked about it too. So I thought, you know, I almost just wrote back, of course, it's Henry Fielding, blah, 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 Dickens love Fielding. And then I said, wait a minute, let's make sure and let's see where this quote comes from. And I found out. So there we go. Let me redo this. Good. There we go. My camera was a little shaky there. That is, and then, well, here's the final last bit now in this chapter. Jingle goes to Rachel Wardle. Forgive intrusion, short acquaintance, no time for ceremony, all discovered, he tells her. And he tells her that Joe has revealed that she and Tupman were, you know, canoodling in the arbor, in the bower, and the family and the old lady knows now, her mother knows now. But he also tells her that Tupman is really in love with her niece, Emily, and that he, Jingle, is in love with her, Aunt Rachel, and wants her to promise herself to him because, you know, Tupman is deceiving her. And she says she will. If he can prove that she will, you know, give her heart to him instead of Tupman. And this is his plot that you'll see. He tells her, you will, you know, and she's, you know, and I should have said the way he tells her, right? She says he loves another. Another? Ejaculated the spinster. Who? Short girl, black eyes, niece Emily. There was a pause. Now, if there was one individual in the whole world of whom the spinster entertained a mortal and deep-rooted jealousy, it was this identical niece. So he picked the right one that she would, you know, not be happy with. So he tells her he's gonna. This is what's gonna happen. He's gonna prove this, and sure enough, at the dinner that they have that night, the spinster aunt could hardly believe her eyes. Mr. Tracy Tupman was established at Emily's side, ogling, whispering, and smiling in opposition to Mr. Snodgrass. Not a word, not a look, not a glance did he bestow upon his heart's prize of the evening before. Like, he's paying all this attention to Emily. And then after that dinner, we find out what happened is Tupman and Mr. Jingle get together, and Tupman says, how did I do it? Splendid, capital, couldn't act better myself. You must repeat the part tomorrow, every evening till further notice. Does Rachel still wish it? What a game, right? Jingle's played here. He's told, you know, Rachel that he's paying attention to Emily, and then he's told Tupman that Rachel wants to throw the scent off from people suspecting that they're a couple, so he should pay attention to Emily. And so that's what he's doing. And this is all Jingle's plot to, you know, to win the woman himself, right? And so Tupman is overjoyed that, you know, that he's done this for him. My dear friend, can I ever repay you? Don't talk of it, replied Jingle. He stopped short, as if suddenly recollecting something, and he said, by the by, can't spare 10 pounds, can you? Very particular purpose. Pay you in 3 days. He's also getting 10 pounds off of him. So a 10-pound note, maybe. We'll see.
Yeah.
What a, you know, the master con man at work here, Jingle, is what we get to see in this part. So, and all in fun for us, I guess, right? So, not for, you know, Tupman and Miss Rachel and Snodgrass is in love with Emily, but all fun for us to watch Jingle in his element. This is what Jingle does. This is what we're learning that Jingle does, and the kind of person he is. He's perhaps not just someone who goes out and meets people, gets invited to dinners. He is perhaps a con man. So we will see as we go along. Well,
he's already seemed like a bit of a con man the way he's gotten all of these free dinners,
mhm.
and free admission to balls and everything else.
And he knows how to get this stuff. But this is now a
Yeah.
plot. This is now he is moving parts around to get. Well,
This is beyond mooching.
yeah. Well, the part ends. You want to read? Take us out. The scene of that afternoon.
The scene of that afternoon was repeated that evening, and on the 3 afternoons and evenings next ensuing. On the 4th, the host was in high spirits, for he had satisfied himself that there was no ground for the charge against Mr. Tupman. So was Mr. Tupman, for Mr. Jingle had told him that his affair would soon be brought to a crisis. So was Mr. Pickwick, for he was seldom otherwise. So was not Mr. Snodgrass, for he had grown jealous of Mr. Tupman. So was the old lady, for she had been winning at whist. So were Mr. Jingle and Miss Wardle, for reasons of sufficient importance in this eventful history to be narrated in another chapter.
The curtain falls on this month's number 3.
Yes.
Well, this is going to be quite exciting to see what goes forward with Jingle and this affair. So, Pickwickians, thank you for joining us for number 3 of Pickwick Monthly. James, thank you so much for joining us on our Pickwick travels. We'll see you again in a few months.
All right.
I know we've changed the order here. We'll have to see what's going forward now. But we were supposed to have Jacob Romanow today, and because I had to switch weeks, we had to change. So thank you so much for jumping in and this, and then we'll have Jake next month. And coming up next month, we have the momentous issue number 4, which introduces Samuel Weller, the first really of Dickens' great comic characters. And it's Sam Weller into the story really makes this Pickwick Papers take off in popularity, which it will do from number 4 on. Also next month, Mr. Pickwick makes an important archaeological discovery. You don't want to miss that. And we get one of my favorite interpolated tales, The Madman's Manuscript. Very likely an influence on Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
Let me remind everyone to subscribe to our channel, to like these videos, and you can support the Rosenbach through donation. Your support helps us create more programs like this and also care for our collections. You can also become a member. Membership gives you early access and discounts to programs and courses. You can find out more at our website, rosenbach.org. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library, and I'll see you all next month for number 4, chapters 9 to 11 of the Pickwick Papers. Thanks so much, James.
Thank you.
Bottle stands, pass it round, way of the sun, through the buttonhole, no heel taps. Bye-bye, everyone.